Hey everyone, this is Bathmetrics. Welcome to episode 11 of Mixing Loud with Clip to Zero. In this video, I'll explain how to keep your mastering engineer happy so that they don't complain that your mix is too loud or too clip sounding, and because of that, they're unable to give you their best results. But I'm also going to be explaining how the CTZ approach helps your mastering engineer to do their best work. And I'll also explain how the CTZ approach helps you determine whether you've got the right mastering engineer for the type of music you produce. Quick reminder, if you're following on this video for the first time, this is part of an ongoing playlist called Mixing Loud with Clip to Zero. We're up to episode 11 now. There are still a lot more episodes coming down here. So if you're interested in keeping track of all the new episodes as they come out, please consider subscribing to my channel. Okay, let's get right into it. We're going to talk and demo this concept with the song that I introduced back in episode 9, I think. And, this sounds great for a self-mastered, self-mixed result, okay? Now, here's the thing. Mastering engineers are very much worth every penny they cost. I'm never going to deny that, right? But it can also be expensive. Not every one of us home producers wants to shell out for a mastering engineer for every song we produce. We may not be in a position to do that. We may not be a big enough artist to do that. You could have plenty of very good reasons. In my case, I'm just stubborn and prideful. And kind of like I heard Deadmau5 once say, I like to know that my art is all me and not necessarily a team effort. But there's nothing wrong with a team effort, right? I'm a big geek about mixing and mastering, so I want to be as good at it as I possibly can be, and I want to know that I control every aspect of my art. You may have different criteria, and that's perfectly fine. And there's no question that the experience and the ear and the depth of really good analog gear that most mastering engineers have and what they bring to the table is very much worth every penny. And if you are signed to a label, even a small independent label, or even if you're not signed to a label, if you have good relationships with a few indie labels and you occasionally have your songs featured on compilation albums they do or whatever it may be, you're going to find that labels often prefer to have their own set of mastering engineers they like to use because those engineers create part of that label's sound and unique signature. And so, depending on where you're at in your semi-professional to professional spectrum and how big you are, you may not have a choice except to work with certain mastering engineers, right? So when you give a mastering engineer a already very loud mix, a surprisingly loud mix to most mastering engineers, some of them are going to give you some feedback about that. And they may say, look, here's the bottom line. I work in loud genres. I know how to get masters really loud, really clean. I have lots of expensive outboard gear. I have special analog EQs that are really good for putting in a really sweet kind of low end, putting in a really sweet kind of top end. I have tricks for making your drum hits a little, just the right amount of punchy and loud, but not squash sounding. I have a whole bag of tricks that you do not have working in the box, okay? So you have to trust me. I'm a mastering engineer. Trust me that I know how to make your mixes sound really loud and really good. And you should trust them, okay? Because most of them do know what they're doing. And most of them can absolutely, positively produce a better result than any one of us can produce working 100% in the box in our DAW with our plugins, okay? What I've been teaching you with the clip to zero method is absolutely, positively, I stake everything on this. It's the best way to do this kind of work fully 100% in the box. You will not get a better result. The old school way that you're taught, the way that most of YouTube teaches you to do your mixing and mastering, is just a bad way. I'm sorry, it is, especially if you work in loud genres. But that's assuming you are a home producer and you work entirely 100% in the box. If you're going to work with a professional mastering engineer, then it's a little bit of a different story. But here's the good news, okay? The CTZ method also allows you to get the very best out of your mastering engineer, and it's so easy. And really, I'm just going to give away the goods right now. This all revolves around what I showed you in episode 8 about how to hit any loudness target with the VCA trick. As you know from episode 8, you might overshoot your intended loudness target and your track ends up being much louder than you think it needs to be. But it's very easy to adjust everything at one knob. You pull everything out of the clipper cascade and make it suddenly a lot less clipped sounding, right? So this same basic trick is also what allows us to give our mastering engineer anything they want. So let me demo this. This is really super easy to show you. I'm going to show you this and then I'll talk just a little bit more about ideology and philosophy and some of the things I promised at the start of this video. So here's our waveform: kick, snare, kick, snare. And this is at our current loudness level of about, I think this is hitting negative 6.3 LUFS, somewhere around there, right? So this is all my mix. There's absolutely nothing live and active on my pre-master bus. These three plugins that I commonly try for final sweetening of the mix on my mix bus, they're not even active right now. All I've got is a clipper at the end. And there's nothing down here on my master bus either, except a final clipper, which isn't doing anything because the clipper on my pre-master is taking care of the clipping up to this point. So there's no mastering limiter. There's no final processing. This is just my raw mix for this song. And it's hitting negative 6.3 LUFS. So if we look at our waveform and we zoom in on this, kick, snare, we're going to zoom in on the snare hit where the kick and the snare are summing together. And we know there's a lot of clipping happening and it's going way over zero. It still sounds good because the clipping's transparent. But if you were to send this mix in this state to a mastering engineer, most of them are going to take one look at the kick and the snare locations in the song and they're going to go, wait a minute, you forgot to turn off the mastering limiter. You need to send me the mix without all your mastering stuff put on, your self-mastering stuff. And you say, well, I did this the clip to zero way. This is my mix. And that's when the mastering engineer is going to go, oh, I see. Well, I'm going to have problems giving you my best result because you're giving me stuff that's already heavily clipped as if it had been run through a mastering limiter. But I have my own process, and my process works better on signals that aren't already clipped this much, right? So if you were working the old school way, you could just turn off the mastering limiter. Clip to zero, you can't do that. Or can you? Because again, this all revolves around the VCA trick, right? With the VCA trick, we effectively have total control over how much clipping is actually being done across the entire project. Remember, we have this whole cascade of clippers. Every track, every bus, there's a clipper. And in front of every single clipper on every track and bus, let me just flip over to this view. We've got these track CTZ devices at every individual track where some sort of source signal is coming from. Okay. And every one of these track CTZ devices, if we go look at one, let's just scooch this out of the way for a second. One of the things we have in the chain is this VCA device that we talked about back in episode 8. And they're basically these gain knobs that are all connected together, and they're ganged to a single gain knob. You might put somewhere convenient, like up here on my structure track, I keep the master gain knob. And if I drop this gain anywhere, from any one of these, if I drop any one of these knobs down to like -8, for example, and I come back over here to my snare track, the actual snare track, thank you, and we look at the same VCA device over here, we can see it's also at -8. So you have one knob that controls the amount of gain that's being pushed into every single source clipper in your entire environment. And that is what allows you to give the mastering engineer what they want, which is a less clipped 2-bus pre-master. So here's what we're going to do. Take a look at the snare. Now, this is a snare hit, and we're going to run this track, and I'm just going to start pulling this downward to pull everything out of the clipper cascade. All right, so if I pull all of the source tracks down by 8 or 9 dB out of the entire set of first clippers in the cascade, suddenly my kick and snare hit is no longer clipped, right? This is what the full waveform looks now. And of course, the kicks are pretty small because they're already very loud and very dense. There's a high RMS inside these kicks. Let's zoom in on this one. All right, so this is my kick, and it doesn't need to be anywhere near as peaky as the combined kick and snare hit. This is just the way the signals sum up. The kick itself does have a little bit of clipping shape on it, but that's the original kick, was already created this way to give it the tone and timbre that it has. And, mastering engineers know this. It's possible some mastering engineer might go, even that kick looks a little squashed, even now that you've given me a pre-master with a lot of headroom on it and no clipping. Your kick itself, clearly the source kick you used is looking a little bit funky. If you were to give me a different kick, I might be able to make it sound even better than this kick. Well, that's an argument you're going to have with your mastering engineer at that time, because depending on how you do your drums in the first place, that may be an easy thing for you to do or a very hard thing for you to do. I'll take a little side trip into a little bit of a philosophical divide. There are broadly, you could take all producers and lump them into two groups. There's people that like to do their drums as audio tracks in their arranger, and they like to plunk down every single kick and snare hit in their timeline and hand edit those things and chop them up and stick them together and do weird things. And they like to visually see all of their drum waveforms in their mix. And then there's a whole nother camp of producers that say, oh, heck no, that's a pain in the butt. I want to do it all with MIDI. And so I'm going to have a drum machine of various sorts playing, my drum samples. And I'll just use MIDI tracks to control, for example, my kicks and snares and hi-hats and so on. So, for example, here's my MIDI track that's doing my kick hits, right? And then I have a different MIDI track that's doing my snare hits. And then I have another MIDI track here that's doing my my cymbal hits, right? And I do it all with MIDI. And everyone's going to be a little different about this. If you work with MIDI, it's very easy to replace or try different drum sounds in your mix, even at the very last minute. It's a lot easier because all you really need to do is go into a given drum machine, and you could, for example, if your MIDI's using these two notes for my hi-hats, I could just move these to different things on the grid, different notes, and try some substitute or different cymbals in place of the original notes, play my mix and see how it sounds, right? So it's very easy to substitute different drums all the way up to the last minute if you work in MIDI. It's much harder if you work in pure audio, okay? So that's just a little quick aside. If you like to use really loud sounding drums that already have some squashing and squishing on them, like right out of the sample pack, some mastering engineers might argue with you. They might make a case for why they think you should give them some sort of alternate drum hit. Point is, just by using the VCA trick, it's like slowly pulling the drive down out of a mastering limiter at the end, or just removing the mastering limiter entirely. Like at this point, absolutely the loudest combined summed signal in my entire project is this big kick and snare hit. So if I've pulled this completely out of the zero marks, this is zero up here, this is zero down here, I could hand this pre-master off to the mastering engineer now, and they would go, great, now I have plenty of waveform to work with. I don't see any clipping anywhere in the waveform, right? So I can do my job well. And that's it. That's the whole trick. If they don't want, the original amount of clipping that you gave them, and they say, can you back off that clipping and give it to me again? Well, you just come in here and drag this down until you don't see any more clipping, and there's obviously plenty of headroom. Like at this point, pulling things down by -6 dB, we can see we still have some peaks that are touching the zero lines. So obviously there's still some clipping hiding here, right? So you just bring it down until you bring it down until you start seeing space between the loudest peaks in your signal and the zero lines. And then that's a perfectly good thing to hand off to your mastering engineer. Okay, so that's the how. That's the simple how to do it. Let's circle back to two things I said at the beginning, which is how using this approach actually helps your mastering engineer to do their best work. Okay, so this goes way back to something a case that I tried to lay out in episode 2, which is why. Why do you even want to use the CTZ process in the first place? And one of the things I told you there was you have to mix a certain way to effectively hit a really clean loudness target. I think I can actually demo this best if I go to my written clip to zero guide. I recently saw a video, Adapter Metric just came out with a new plugin called Sculpt that I'm very interested in. But Justin Coletti was interviewing the lead designer. They had this interesting conversation at a certain point. Let's follow this link for you real quick. He's asking a question about loudness levels for streaming platforms. And the link in my guide that I just showed you will take you right to this spot in this video because it's very interesting. And Justin does a really good job of explaining something I try to explain often over and over to people who haven't encountered this idea yet. You have to make very, very, very specific kinds of mixing decisions and arrangement decisions and sequencing decisions in your total song arrangement and composition. You have to make all these special decisions when you play in very loud genres. The sound of loudness isn't just how much you're squishing the sound with clippers or limiters or whatever, or adding extra saturation. It's more than just that. It's also tricks you have to use to EQ sounds a certain way so that a lot of sounds happening near each other and on top of each other can share the space well and not create so much clutter and summing that clipping it sounds bad, right? Like right down to your basic EQ decisions, which I will be getting into in future episodes. I'm going to be getting into these episodes here where I start talking about EQing and stereo field manipulation and depth field manipulation. I'm going to talk about some of these basic decisions that he summarizes in this clip. But he's going to be saying, look, there's this entire way you approach production to make a clean result that is also loud, and it's part of the sound of loudness. And the designer of the plugin is saying, yeah, of course, right? That's just how it works. And I'm really surprised how many people haven't encountered that concept yet. So I recommend you go watch that clip because it's a good refresher. But the point is, when you work with clip to zero, right from the very beginning of your project, right from the first kick and snare and sub you pick, and then you start finding other sounds to build up into a song arrangement around those core framework sounds. Right from the get-go, you're making all these micro decisions about what kind of sound works, what kind of sound doesn't. Oh, I'm trying to layer these two sounds together. I need to make certain EQing decisions so that they share the space nicely between them, and each owns their own part of the spectrum. I need to make one of them own this part of the stereo field and the other one own a different part of the stereo field so that they're using the full width of the stereo field together in a way that lets them both be loud together and yet you can hear them both clearly together. There's all these decisions you make by working in a loud manner right from the very beginning. And because you've made all those general mixing decisions as you've been working, your final mix is much easier for a mastering engineer to get loud and sound really good loud, even after you've handed them the mix that's been dropped down a little bit so that it's not actually, up in that full dynamic range anymore. Like this is the same mix whether it's at this level or whether I bring it down 9 dB and give it to the mastering engineer at this level. It's going to sound exactly the same. I mean, now there's a little more snap on the snare because it's not being clipped as hard, right? That's the only difference. Everything else in this mix is balanced. Everything is balanced and EQ'd and spread across the sound stage and spread across the depth stage and saturated. And, all the sound design has been done so that this whole thing can sound good when it's finally squeezed back up into a small dynamic range again. And the only difference between how we do it in clip to zero versus how a mastering engineer does it with their analog gear and running things through special, analog devices and EQs and then clipping it back through their analog to digital converter and recording it at 96K or 192K or whatever they like to work at for super high resolution. The only difference is they're doing the same thing we're doing, but with better quality. With better quality gear and some processes that we don't have available to us, that's just going to be the same result, but better sounding, okay? But you've already built your mix in a way that lets them get that right balance and right energy of everything, okay? If you had built this the old school way down at -18, -23, -12, not paying attention to how peaks are adding up on each other, not having to make some really hard decisions about which kind of sounds play nicely with which other sounds, or whether a sound can even survive being crushed and squeezed up into a tight dynamic range. If you hadn't done all that thinking up front, the mastering engineer wouldn't be able to get as good a result out of it because your mix wasn't built for loudness in the first place. That's the point I'm trying to get across here. So by working the CTZ way, you're already building the best possible mix, like a mastering engineer's dream mix. This person understands loudness. They know how to mix to get a loud result. And the only thing I need them to do is just pull everything back out of the clippers so that I'm not working with already clipped peaks, right? Take everything down, give me headroom to work with so I can do my process to squish all this back up to something that looks more like this. But the mastering engineer says, I'm going to do it my way with my processes and my gear. And in the end, you're going to get something that looks exactly like this again, essentially, but it'll sound a teeny bit better. That's the idea. That's the hoped for result with a good mastering engineer who knows how to master in loud genres, okay? So that's kind of my summary of why CTZ helps your mastering engineer to do their best possible work, okay? Now, the last thing I said I was going to talk about is how the CTZ approach helps you determine whether or not you've got the right mastering engineer for the type of music you produce, assuming you can choose this, right? I have quite a few friends who are professional mastering engineers in the New York industry and also in the Los Angeles industry. And some of them they're all amazing engineers, but I can tell you for a fact, some of them do not know how to master in loud genres. They can't. They don't know the tricks. They don't have the gear. They work in a whole different kind of music or television broadcast production or whatever. And they don't know what all the tricks for loudness. So there are plenty of engineers out there that are really, really excellent mastering engineers who, if you hand them your mix and say, I need this to hit competitive loudness for bass music, they'll say, sure, I think I can do that. And they'll give you a mix back and you'll go, that's not really what I had in mind. It doesn't seem to have the right energy or density. It's not actually as loud as I want. It doesn't sound like the other artists in this genre that I need to be mixing in and out of for playlists. I mean, I'll be honest. I've had this happen to me when I've had a friend say, let me master for you. I'm like, okay, here you go. And I wasn't happy with the results. And that's hard, right? Not that they were a bad engineer. They just didn't know loudness. So with you being able to get your own very loud, very competitive, right up there with your reference tracks kind of results, and you being able to do everything in the box and get a really clean, loud mix, you now have something to compare against what a mastering engineer gives you, and you can make a better informed judgment about, are they the right person for this job? It's not a matter of whether they know what they're doing. All pros know what they're doing. The question is, are they really specialized in loudness? Can they actually get a better sounding result than you can get yourself using clip to zero and doing it all in the box, right in the mix? Okay, that's the big question. So, right, when you hand this mix to them and say, this is how loud I'm able to get it working 100% in the box. This is my mix. No mastering, no limiting on it, just my mix, and I'm already hitting this amount of loudness. Can you give me something that sounds better than this? Okay, that's the acid test. And you have a way to compare what you're able to do versus what they're able to do. And let's be honest, you're going to run into some mastering engineers, especially if you're still in that early stage of your artistry, and just go find some mastering engineer on the internet, or a friend of a friend recommended somebody or whatever, and you say, hey, I want to try you out. Can you master my song? Well, it really helps to have them hear what your best loudness approach sounds like, so they can be challenging themselves to come up with something better using their technique and their gear. Or flipping it around, it helps you compare and judge their result against what you're able to do yourself. And you can make some honest, informed, subjective opinions about whether or not that's the right mastering engineer for you and your music, and the kind of vision you have for your sound and your output. So I don't want to belabor that point too much, but it just makes you a more informed consumer of mastering services. We'll leave it at that. So that's everything I have to say about this, and I'll see you in the next episode.